Arrogant bikers laugh at a teen, moments later, they're begging for mercy. The city street was alive with movement. Cars honked, pedestrians rushed across crosswalks, and the distant hum of traffic filled the air. Among the chaos, a group of bikers sat idling at the curb, their loud laughter cutting through the noise. They were dressed in worn leather jackets, their motorcycles gleaming under the afternoon sun. At the center of the group was Trent, the leader, a man in his mid-30s with a cocky smirk and an unmistakable air of dominance. He nudged his friend beside him and nodded toward a lone teenager walking down the sidewalk. The teen, no older than 17, walked with a steady pace, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his hoodie. He had a backpack slung over one shoulder, and his dark eyes remained fixed ahead, as if the jeering bikers didn't exist. Trent's grin widened. He revved his engine, the sudden roar startling a nearby pedestrian but not the boy. That only made Trent more interested. Well, Trent drawled, motioning for his group to follow as he slowly rolled his bike forward. Looks like we got ourselves a tough guy. The other bikers chuckled, circling in closer, their motorcycles blocking the teen's path. The boy stopped, his face still calm, unreadable. Another biker, a younger one with wild hair and an overconfident stance, leaned in. "You lost, kid." He glanced at the teen's bag. "What you got in there?" "Your school books." Trent smirked and dismounted his bike, stepping forward to invade the boy's space. "You're acting real confident for someone standing alone." The teen finally spoke. His voice was even, almost amused. "I don't see a problem." That annoyed Trent. "Oh yeah? Maybe you should." With a quick movement, he grabbed the teen's backpack and yanked it off his shoulder. For the first time, the boy's expression changed. A flicker of something, maybe irritation, maybe something deeper, crossed his face. But he didn't panic. He didn't even move to take the bag back. He simply watched. Trent unzipped the bag, expecting to find nothing but books or a lunch, something he could mock. But as he peered inside, his smirk faltered. His fingers stiffened around the fabric. The other bikers, seeing his sudden hesitation, leaned in to look. One of them swore under his breath. Another took a small step back. Trent's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, masking his unease with a forced chuckle. "What the hell is this?" His voice lacked the same bravado as before. The teen took a slow step forward, reaching for the bag. Trent jerked slightly, a reaction he hadn't intended to show. The boy took the bag back without a struggle, slinging it over his shoulder as if nothing had happened. The bikers exchanged glances, silent communication passing between them. One of them, an older man with silver streaks in his beard, narrowed his eyes. "I know who he is," he muttered to Trent. "We need to leave. Now." Trent turned to him, scoffing. "What are you talking about? He's just a kid." "No," the older biker said firmly. "He isn't." Trent looked back at the teen, but something about the way the boy stood, the way he remained completely unfazed, sent an uncomfortable shiver down his spine. For the first time, he noticed that the kid wasn't nervous. He wasn't scared. He was in control. Trent clenched his jaw, trying to shake the feeling. "I don't care who he thinks he is." He reached for the boy's shoulder. In a single, fluid motion, the teen sidestepped and swept his leg behind Trent's knee. Trent's balance faltered, and before he could react, he was on the ground, gasping. A stunned silence filled the air. The bikers froze. The teen adjusted his bag and looked down at Trent, his expression unreadable. "I warned you," he said simply. The other bikers stiffened, waiting for Trent's reaction. Trent, breathing heavily, stayed on the ground. His confidence was gone. The power had shifted. The teen turned, walking away without another word. The bikers said nothing as they watched him disappear down the street. The older one shook his head. "We got lucky," he muttered. Trent, still on the ground, didn't argue. Trent's palms pressed against the pavement, the rough asphalt biting into his skin. His breath came in short, shallow bursts, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He had been knocked down, not by another biker, not by some trained fighter, but by a teenager. His pride burned hotter than the scraped skin on his arms. One of the younger bikers, Vince, hesitated before stepping forward. Trent? You good, man?" Trent growled under his breath, pushing himself up. His fingers curled into fists. "Shut up." But even as he snapped at his own crew, his hands were shaking. His heart was racing. The kid had barely tried. That was the part that gnawed at him the most. That wasn't luck. That wasn't some fluke. The kid knew exactly what he was doing. The rest of the gang was silent, watching. Some of them shifted uneasily. A few stole glances down the road where the teen had disappeared. No one laughed anymore. Then, the older biker, the one who had warned Trent, stepped forward. His name was Hank, and unlike the others, his face wasn't full of confusion or anger. It was full of something closer to fear. Trent noticed it and scowled. "What's your problem, old man?" Hank exhaled slowly. "You don't get it, do you?" His voice was low, even. "You ever hear of the man they called the Ghost?" A few of the other bikers exchanged confused looks. Vince furrowed his brows. "The Ghost? The underground fighter? That's just an urban legend." "No," Hank said, shaking his head. "He's real. Or at least, he was. The stories say he trained in every style: boxing, jiu-jitsu, Muay Thai, fought all over the world. One fights without taking a single hit. People say he disappeared, retired early. But before he did, he trained one student." Trent scoffed, dusting off his jacket. "And you think that kid, was trained by some mythical fighter?" Hank didn't answer right away. He just let the silence stretch. Then, in a near whisper, he said, "Did you see his stance?" Trent's jaw clenched. He had seen it. The way the kid had moved so effortlessly, like every step was part of a bigger plan. That wasn't the kind of thing you learned from getting into street fights. That was training. The realization made his skin crawl. Another biker, Reggie, shook his head, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, guys, let's not get dramatic. Kid was quick, sure. But we're a gang. We don't back down from some teenager." Trent latched onto the statement, his bruised ego screaming for revenge. "Damn right," he spat. "We don't let some punk walk all over us." Hank's expression darkened. "You really want to do this?" But Trent was already moving, swinging a leg over his bike, twisting the throttle hard. The engine roared. "We'll find him," he declared. "Teach him a lesson." A few bikers hesitated, but when Trent sped off down the street, the others followed. Except Hank. He stayed behind, staring down the road, shaking his head. The gang split up, combing through alleyways, scanning sidewalks. They didn't have to search long. The kid was sitting on the edge of a deserted basketball court, tossing a ball idly between his hands, as if he had been waiting for them. Trent pulled up first, the others forming a half-circle around him. He stepped off his bike, this time approaching more cautiously. The kid glanced up, completely unfazed. "You again," he said, tossing the basketball once more. "Didn't learn your lesson?" Trent's lips curled into a sneer. "Cocky little punk." He pulled out a brass knuckle from his pocket and slipped it onto his fist. "Let's see how cocky you are when I put you in the dirt." The kid's gaze flickered to the weapon, then back to Trent's face. For the first time, he let out a small, amused breath, a laugh. Trent charged. The kid didn't move until the last second. With a single, swift step, he sidestepped the attack, grabbing Trent's arm and twisting it into a lock so fast that Trent barely had time to react. Crack! Trent screamed as pain exploded up his arm. The gang froze. The teen finally spoke, voice as calm as ever. "Try that again," he said, releasing Trent and letting him stumble backward. "See how it ends this time." No one moved. Then, for the first time, Trent looked truly afraid. Trent stumbled back, his arm throbbing. His breath came in ragged gasps, his mind still struggling to process what had just happened. The rest of the gang stood frozen, the reality sinking in. This wasn't just some lucky hit, the kid knew exactly what he was doing. Reggie shifted uncomfortably, his fingers twitching at his side. "Trent, maybe we should." "Shut up," Trent snapped, shaking off the pain. His pride was burning hotter than the ache in his arm. He couldn't let this punk humiliate him again. Not in front of his own crew. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a switchblade, flipping it open with a metallic click. The kid's eyes flickered to the blade. No fear. No hesitation. Just calculated awareness. Trent grinned, trying to regain control. "Still think you're untouchable, huh?" The kid sighed and finally stood up, rolling his shoulders. "You don't get it," he said, voice even. "I'm giving you a way out. Walk away, and we forget this happened." A tense silence stretched between them. Then Trent lunged. The blade sliced through the air, aimed straight for the kid's ribs, but in an instant, the teen sidestepped and caught Trent's wrist mid-swing. A sharp twist. The knife clattered to the pavement. Trent barely had time to react before the kid snapped a precise kick to his knee, a calculated strike, not enough to break it, but enough to send Trent collapsing. He hit the ground hard, groaning in pain. The gang froze, their confidence shattered. The kid took a step back, shaking his head. "I told you to walk away." Reggie, usually the loudest, took an uneasy step back. "What the hell are you?" The kid met his gaze, calm, unshaken. "Someone you should have left alone." Hank, still sitting on his bike, exhaled slowly. "That's enough." His voice cut through the tension. "We're done here." But Trent, still on his knees, let out a snarl of rage. His body shook, not just from pain, but from sheer humiliation. His whole gang had seen him fall, twice. He couldn't let it end like this. With a sudden, desperate move, he grabbed a handful of gravel and dirt, throwing it straight at the kid's face. The moment of distraction was all he needed. Trent lunged again, fists swinging wildly. The kid wiped his eyes just in time to see the attack coming. This time, there was no hesitation. A single punch to the gut, perfectly placed, perfectly timed. Trent gasped as the air was forced from his lungs. He staggered back, his body curling inward. Then came the final blow. The kid's elbow shot forward, striking just below Trent's jawline. A precise, powerful strike. Trent's head snapped back. His body went limp. And then, he dropped. Flat on his back. His gang stared, completely silent. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Vince muttered, voice barely above a whisper, "He's out cold." Reggie took another step back. "Screw this, man. I'm not getting my face broken for Trent's ego." The bikers started shifting, their confidence in their leader completely gone. One by one, they looked at the kid, and saw someone they never should have messed with. Hank sighed. "We had it coming." The kid looked down at Trent's unconscious form for a moment before turning away. His shoulders were relaxed, his expression unchanged, as if this had never been a fight to begin with. He picked up his backpack, slung it over his shoulder, and started walking. Not a single biker stopped him. As he reached the sidewalk, he glanced back just once. "Next time," he said, "pick on someone you can actually beat." Then he disappeared into the city, leaving the gang broken and silent in his wake. Trent groaned, his vision swimming as he slowly regained consciousness. His head throbbed, his jaw ached, and his ego had been obliterated. He blinked up at the sky, trying to piece together what had happened, but then it all came rushing back, the fight, the humiliation, the moment his body hit the pavement like a sack of bricks. A shadow loomed over him. Hank. Trent gritted his teeth and pushed himself up, ignoring the burning pain in his ribs. The rest of the gang stood nearby, their faces unreadable, their confidence in him completely gone. Vince crossed his arms. "So, we gonna talk about what just happened?" Trent shot him a glare, but he knew he had nothing to say. What excuse could he possibly make? He had led them here. He had picked this fight. And he had lost. Reggie kicked at the gravel with his boot. "Dude wiped the floor with you. Hell, he could have taken us all." Trent wiped blood from the corner of his mouth. "Shut it." But they weren't mocking him, they were genuinely shaken. That was the worst part. Hank, who had been silent until now, let out a long breath. That kid wasn't normal. Trent shot him a look, still struggling to regain control of the situation. "You scared of some punk?" Hank met his gaze, calm and steady. "No. I'm scared of what happens when a guy like that decides he's had enough of people like us." Silence. Trent clenched his fists. He wanted to deny it, to call them cowards, but the truth was, he had never been this afraid before. His body still felt the echoes of the kid's strikes. They hadn't been wild punches or lucky hits. They had been deliberate, precise, like the kid had known exactly how to take him apart. Vince rubbed his arms, his usual bravado gone. "I say we just, drop it, man. It's done." Reggie nodded. "Yeah, we go after him again, and next time, he won't be so nice." The word nice made Trent's stomach turn. That was what really got to him. The kid hadn't even tried to hurt him. If he had wanted to, if he had really let loose, Trent knew he wouldn't have woken up at all. Hank stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You listen to me, Trent. We run in a crew, yeah? But not a single one of us is sticking our neck out for you if you try this again." The rest of the bikers nodded. Trent felt his power slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. For the first time, he wasn't the leader anymore. He tried to stand tall, to look like he wasn't shaken to his core, but his body betrayed him, his hands trembled. Hank gave him one last look before shaking his head. "I think we're done here." One by one, the gang mounted their bikes. Trent watched, a sinking feeling in his gut, as they rode off into the distance. No one looked back. No one waited for him. He was alone. Trent let out a slow breath, staring at the empty street, the weight of his humiliation settling deep into his bones. The kid was gone. His gang was gone. And for the first time in his life, Trent realized what it felt like to be truly powerless. Trent stood there, alone, the roar of his gang's motorcycles fading into the distance. His fingers curled into fists, his body still aching from the humiliating beating. The weight of what had just happened settled deep into his chest. He had lost everything in a matter of minutes. A gust of wind blew through the empty street, and for the first time in years, Trent felt small. He had built his reputation on intimidation, on being untouchable. But now, he was just a beaten man, abandoned by the very people who used to look up to him. His knee wobbled as he bent down, picking up his discarded knife. The metal felt cold against his palm, but there was no comfort in holding it now. What good was a blade if he couldn't even land a hit? A low chuckle echoed from behind him. Trent spun around, his heart pounding. The kid was back. He was standing just outside the shadows of an alleyway, leaning casually against a lamppost, arms crossed. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, not mockery, not amusement. Something calm, calculating. Trent's breath hitched in his throat. The kid hadn't left. Trent swallowed hard. "What do you want?" His voice was hoarse, lacking its usual arrogance. The kid tilted his head slightly. "Just making sure you got the message." Trent bristled, his pride flaring for just a second before dying out. He clenched his jaw. "Yeah," he muttered. "I got it." The kid studied him for a moment, then pushed off the lamppost. He stepped forward, slow, deliberate. Trent stiffened, his muscles instinctively tensing. The kid stopped just a few feet away, his presence unnervingly still. You ever heard of the phrase, pick your battles? The kid asked. His voice was calm, but there was something heavy in the way he said it. Trent forced a bitter laugh. Yeah. Guess I picked the wrong one. The kid's gaze didn't waver. It wasn't just the wrong fight. He took another step closer. It was the wrong kind of fight. Trent blinked, his body screaming at him to step back. But he didn't. He couldn't. The kid continued, his voice quieter now, almost like he was giving Trent a warning. You've spent your life pushing people down. Making them afraid. That works, until you run into someone who isn't. The words hit Trent like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no response. Because the kid was right. For years, Trent had relied on fear, on the weight of his gang, on the way people flinched when he walked by. But none of that had mattered today. Fear had no effect on someone who didn't feel it. Trent exhaled shakily. So what now? The kid shrugged. That's up to you. For a long moment, they just stood there. Then, with a final glance at the knife in Trent's hand, the kid turned around and walked away, disappearing into the city lights. Trent stood in place, gripping the knife so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then, after a moment, he let it fall. The clang of metal against pavement echoed in the silence. Trent stood there, his chest rising and falling, his fingers twitching as the cold night air settled in. The metallic clang of his knife against the pavement echoed in his ears longer than it should have. It felt like a final nail in the coffin of his reputation. He clenched his jaw, refusing to acknowledge the humiliation burning in his gut. His gang was gone. His power was gone. And worst of all, he knew the kid had let him off easy. That fact gnawed at him more than anything else. He took an uneasy step forward, his legs still weak from the fight. The alley around him felt too quiet, the city lights flickering in the distance. He had been in hundreds of fights, won almost all of them. But this wasn't a loss. This was a lesson. Trent turned, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets, his body aching with every step. His pride screamed at him to get revenge, to find the kid again, to prove he wasn't weak. But deep down, he knew better. There was no beating someone like that. Not unless you changed. He walked for a while, the streets quieter than usual, his mind playing the fight over and over again. Every dodge, every strike, every calculated movement. He had never seen anything like it. What had Hank said earlier? That kid wasn't normal. Trent had laughed then. He wasn't laughing now. A familiar neon glow caught his eye, and he realized where his feet had taken him. The rusty gear, the biker bar where his crew usually gathered. Or at least, used to. He hesitated at the entrance, wondering if any of them were inside. Would they still follow him after tonight? Would he even want them to? With a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The smell of beer and cigarette smoke hit him immediately. Conversations hummed around the room, laughter rumbling from a booth in the back. Then, silence. Heads turned. Eyes locked on him. Vince, sitting at the bar, let out a low whistle. Well, look who's still breathing. A few chuckles followed, but they weren't mocking. They were curious. Trent ignored the looks and walked straight to the counter. The bartender, a grizzled man with a permanent scowl, raised an eyebrow. You look like hell. Feel worse, Trent muttered, sliding onto a stool. The bartender poured a shot of whiskey without being asked, sliding the glass across the bar. Heard some rumors, he said. About a kid. About you hitting the pavement. Trent tensed. He could feel the other bikers listening. He didn't answer right away. He just stared at the glass, his reflection warping in the amber liquid. Vince leaned against the counter, swirling his own drink. So? What happened? Trent's fingers curled around the glass, his grip tight. The words sat heavy on his tongue, but finally, he muttered, I lost. No one spoke. The word felt foreign coming out of his mouth. but saying it didn't feel like weakness. It felt like truth. Vince studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. That kid, he really that good? Trent exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Better. Another silence. Then Reggie, sitting in the booth, leaned forward. What now? Trent considered the question. For years, every fight had been about proving something: dominance, strength, respect. But tonight had shown him something else. Power meant nothing if you used it the wrong way. He knocked back the whiskey, the burn in his throat grounding him. Then, setting the glass down, he finally answered. I don't know. But for the first time in years, he wanted to find out. Trent sat in silence, the weight of his own words settling in. I lost. The truth of it felt raw, but for the first time, it didn't feel like an excuse or an insult, it felt like a turning point. The bar remained quiet for a few moments, the usual rowdy energy of the place subdued. The others weren't sure how to react. Trent had always been the toughest, the guy who never backed down. And yet, here he was, acknowledging defeat. Vince was the first to break the silence. He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Damn. Never thought I'd hear you admit that. Trent didn't react. He just stared at the empty glass in front of him, turning it slowly between his fingers. His knuckles were still bruised, his body still aching from the fight, but the pain wasn't what bothered him. It was the realization, the shift happening inside him. The bartender wiped down the counter, watching him with an unreadable expression. Most guys would take a beating like that and either run or try to get even, he muttered. So what's it gonna be, Trent? The old Trent, the one who thrived on fear, on making others cower, would have already been planning his revenge. But tonight had changed something. The kid had held back. He could have left Trent broken, but he didn't. Instead, he gave him a lesson, one that no one else had ever dared to give. Trent exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. There's no getting even with someone like that. Reggie leaned forward from his booth. So what, you just let it go? His tone wasn't mocking. It was genuine curiosity. Trent finally looked up, meeting his gaze. Yeah. Another silence stretched between them, but this time, it was different. Vince studied him for a long moment before nodding. Smartest thing I've ever heard you say. A few chuckles rippled through the group, but they weren't mean-spirited. There was something different in the air, a mutual understanding, maybe even a sliver of respect. The bartender smirked, setting another drink in front of Trent. Well, hell. Maybe there's hope for you yet. Trent didn't respond right away. He just stared at the amber liquid, his thoughts racing. For years, he had ruled by force, convinced that strength was the only thing that mattered. But tonight, a kid half his size had taken all that power away in seconds. Not because he was stronger, but because he was better. The fight wasn't about winning. It never had been. It was about control. And maybe it was time to stop fighting the wrong battles. He pushed the drink away, standing up. His body still ached, but his mind felt clearer than it had in years. I need to take a walk, he muttered, tossing some bills on the counter. Vince raised an eyebrow. Since when do you walk away from a free drink? Trent glanced toward the door, his expression unreadable. Since tonight. The others watched as he headed out, the bell above the door jingling softly behind him. The night air was crisp against his skin, the streetlights casting long shadows along the sidewalk. The city buzzed with life, but for once, Trent wasn't looking for a fight. He didn't know where he was going. But for the first time in a long time, he was ready to find out. And somewhere in the distance, hidden among the city's many faces, the kid was watching. He smirked, then turned and disappeared into the night.